Hey everyone, in this section we will look at a shift in the aggregate demand curve. The aggregate demand curve can shift to the right or shift to the left. The components of aggregate demand are consumption, investment, government expenses, and net exports. If any of these components increases, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. If any of these components decreases, the aggregate demand will shift to the left. So over here I have the Business Confidence Survey by OECD and Consumer Sentiment Survey by the University of Michigan. Looks like the index of consumer sentiment is 72.3 out of 100 for May 2020. This consumer sentiment goes down during recession and goes up during expansion. These are not really precise measures, but if this increases, the consumption component of aggregate demand increases and aggregate demand will shift to the right. Also, if you look at the Business Tendencies Survey, the Organization for Economic Development and Cooperation collects business opinion survey data for 21 countries on future selling prices, employment, and other business conditions. This goes down during a recession and goes back up during an expansion. So when any of this confidence increases, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. Now take a look at this G component here. We have two government policies that also works. So if we have a tax cut or increase in government spending, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. On the contrary, if tax increases and or government expenses decreases, the aggregate demand curve will shift to the left. Also with the net export parts, if this increases, the aggregate demand shifts to the right, decreases, aggregate demand will shift to the left. Now show this to you graphically. The long run aggregate supply curve is already plotted for convenience, and the output associated with the long run aggregate supply curve is the potential gross domestic product. I did not really mean to intersect the aggregate demand AD0 to LRAS, but that's absolutely fine. Say we have this as our initial aggregate demand. This is the short run aggregate supply. Whenever the aggregate demand intersects the aggregate supply, we have the real gross domestic product. Let's say the real gross domestic product is 50, the price is 50, and initially we are at point E0 in both these graphs. Now what happens if any of these components are increasing? If any of this increases, the aggregate demand is going to shift to the right. Nothing happens here to the long run aggregate supply curve or the short run aggregate supply curve. I'm at a new point of intersection here. My price went up, my real gross domestic product went up. I can compare point E0 to point E1. Point E0, the real gross domestic product is way less than potential gross domestic product. That means the economy is in a recession. This point E1, my real GDP is still less than potential gross domestic product, but it's really getting close and it's not as bad as point E0. So unemployment would be low at point E1 compared to point E0. My conclusion here is when aggregate demand shifts to the right, price increases and real gross domestic product also goes up. Now take a look at the other graph here where I'm going to show what happens when the aggregate demand curve shifts to the left. So again, the aggregate supply curve or the aggregate long run aggregate supply curve, neither of them are shifting. Okay, I can stick to this color here. I have two other points, E0 and E1. I can compare E0 to E1 and I see the price went down and real gross domestic product also went down. Okay, so that's basically it. When AD increases, everything goes up. When AD decreases, price and real gross domestic product both goes down. Thank you very much.